Tonight, we look at the story that has been told about the murder of JonBenet Ramsey and why so many think her parents guilty, and what this tells us about the America she so briefly lived in.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science, the most authentic voice in true crime. This is episode 34 in the ongoing series. In this episode, we look at the White Nylon Cord and what it means. Now, in True Crime Rocket Science, as soon as we start deep diving into the evidence, we are starting to look at the crime scene through a straw. And when we do that, we've got to be very careful. We've got to be very careful how our thinking changes, and what we've got to try and do to anchor ourselves, to keep ourselves anchored in reality, is to sort of have one foot in the door of, the detailed crime scene and another foot leading us to the rest of the home. So essentially what you're talking about is seeing artifacts of a crime scene, I guess, in 3 dimensions. So in terms of the nylon cord, and already there we are almost overstepping the mark, certainly in terms of this video, we start off by defining what it is. So we're saying, okay, there is something that looks like cord or string, you could even call it rope. What is it? Not only like what is it, what material is it, where does it come from? And we're gonna deal with that, but essentially what you want to do is define what you are talking about. What is the sort of technical consensus? What is the technical definition of the thing that we are looking at? Now, at the same time that we make a kind of a technical assessment, okay, so this is what we are looking at, we don't want to get stuck on the definition. So we don't want the definition to override everything else, if that makes sense. Then we want to identify the puzzle piece in a more general sense. So, you might say, well, that is a tent cord, right? And so that is all that it can be used for. No, you want to sort of know in the context in which it was found, that is how you want to identify the puzzle piece. What is it beyond the label of what it is? That's the second dimension. So, and then the third dimension, I guess, is see how it fits into patterns of people. So you've got this artifact, you've defined it, now you want to identify it. Now you want to link the identity of the puzzle piece to patterns of people, family dynamics, the schema of the crime scene. Okay, does that make sense? It probably doesn't make a lot of sense. The only way it will make sense is when you kind of practically go through what we're talking about, and then I think it will make sense. What I want you to try to do with your mind as we go through this, it's really experimenting with your mind. It's changing the way you think about things. So, in the same way people want to label things and have stereotypes and have a clear, unambiguous answer, we like certainty. You've got to kind of open a doorway, leave something open to, I won't say intuition, but to something that it can hold hands with. And that's only going to come along as you get more information. Okay, so you don't want to tie yourself or cage yourself into a particular thinking constraint, right? We're talking about cords here, and we'll eventually get to knots and all that kind of thing. So bear in mind what the evidence item we're dealing with here is really just the cord. And yet the cord becomes a knot of some kind. And the knot of some kind is connected to this piece of wood, this stick. And that in turn is connected to something else. And JonBenet's hair is tied inside the knot against the stick. And obviously it also culminates or terminates around her throat. And it's for that reason that you want to identify these artifacts, but you also want to link them at the end of the day to something bigger. And then once you've done that in a realistic way, in a holistic way, you can start linking all the puzzle pieces to one another. And if they hold together cohesively, well, then you've got a scenario that sort of makes sense. Now, in a lot of forums, you'll get this incredible anal backbiting, this people sniping at one another and arguing endlessly. Is it this kind of knot or that? Is it this kind of material or that? And what they never get to is they never graduate to, okay, what is your theory of everything? And that is kind of also how defense case works. The defense case works on the prosecution will try and lay out certain points or highlights. And what a good defense will try to do is undermine each of those points so that the whole mosaic falls apart. The whole mosaic can't really fit together. And so what they really want to do, the people who are trying to dismiss theories, criticize theories, undermine theories, is attack or challenge each little link in the chain, right? And you will never get those same people to where you say, okay, let's put the hat on your head. Now give us a full scenario of, here's all the evidence, here's all the information, now you put it together. And you sort of wonder where these people come from, who they're affiliated with, because they never seem to want to do that. They seem to be a stuck record, just stuck on, let me invalidate this little point that you made. So I want to try and urge you guys to not fall into that trap. You can obviously listen to the scenario and then make up your own mind. See what makes sense to you given the massive amounts of information we've got. I mean, one thing we're not lacking is information. The trouble with information is you've got so much information, how much of it is true and authentic, and how much in terms of how much of it is anchored in the reality of the crime scene, and how much of it is sort of pageantry. And I don't just mean the pageantry of the crime scene itself, I mean the pageantry that happened in the aftermath. And you're going to start feeling that in this episode. You're going to feel the pageantry in the aftermath and how that affects the original setup. Okay. And it's on a simple thing like, what is this that we're looking at? Is it nylon cord? This is how you can conjure something into something else. So what I want to do, and we're going to get practical in a moment, what I want you to do is think about that metaphor of seeing the woods for the trees. You can often get lost where you are so focused on a detail that you forget where you are. You forget how it fits into something, right? So what we're trying to do here is do both. In the same way that I said you have your foot in the door of the evidence, where you're looking at something in a more specific and a detailed way, you still want to have access to everything else, the rest of the crime scene, the rest of the... So it's almost like having your foot in the door of a room and the rest of you has access to the rest of the house. Does that make sense? So in terms of the woods metaphor, it's the same thing. Pay attention to a leaf or a branch and see the tree, but also see where the tree is located in the woods. And that's what we want to do with the next couple of evidence items that we're going to be dealing with. So starting with the white nylon cord. We want to know not just what it is, but what it means. But before we get to that, thank you for subscribing to the channel, those who have over the past day or so. If you haven't subscribed, please do. You can click on the light blue icon at the bottom right of your screen. Like, share, leave a comment, and let's get started. So I'm going to start by stepping completely away from the whole nylon cord thing. I'm not even going to go into that immediately, and I'm doing that to help shape your thinking. So I'm actually performing a kind of a hypnosis on you, and obviously it's not going to work if you don't consent to it. So I'm going to give you the spiel, and if you say, no, I don't really agree with that, I don't want to listen any further, then I'm not going to hypnotize you. Once you've heard the hypnosis, you might say, oh, I see where you're going with it, I want to be hypnotized. It sounds a lot worse than it is, so let me get to the crux of it. On page 498 of Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, there's a little bit of analysis from the FBI profilers who worked on the Ramsey case. Now it's plural. It was possibly Greg McCreary, but they're not really named. Obviously these aren't including, well, actually I'm not sure if that's true for a fact. I don't think it includes John Douglas, but it's basically FBI profilers. This is from page 498. And as far as they were concerned, somebody spent time staging the crime scene and hiding the body, and that pointed to a killer who had asked, how do I explain this? I've got this, I've caused this, I've created this situation, I'm presented with this situation, how am I going to explain this? And then he had answered this question, or she had answered the question by saying, a stranger did this. I didn't do this. This person that I know didn't do this. This other person in the house didn't do this. How do I explain this? Well, a stranger did it. And then the staging suggests, as according to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, the staging suggested that there was a killer desperate to divert attention. I agree with that. I think there's almost, in the same way that the crime itself, just limited to the actual crime itself, was kind of overkill, while the staging was also like a 3-page ransom note, overkill in terms of staging. So what's quite interesting, I'm quoting now from Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, is how the FBI kind of imagined this. And this is now trying to see the woods. And it's quite important from both sides of this equation to get the proper handle on what you are looking at. So if you're looking at the woods, you'd want to know, okay, well, where are these woods? In which state are they? What state are the woods in? What woods are we talking about? Is it pine forest? Is it this? Is it that? Is it arboreal forest? What are we talking about? But just in a general sense, you want to get your woods right, and you want to get your trees right. And if you can get your trees and your woods to kind of align, to sort of be the same thing, then you're going to end up with, just in terms of that specific area, you're going to get somewhere. You're going to have found something that's an authentic puzzle piece, okay? So let me illustrate that now. So the FBI profilers were saying that they were seeing staging within staging. I don't know if I agree with that. I think I agree with it in a way, but not in the way that they mean. But they basically say the following, and this is quoting from page 498 of Perfect Murder, Perfect Town. Quote, the loop of cord around one wrist was not a real indication that John Bonet had been restrained. End quote. So what they're saying there is that what you're seeing with this cord around her wrist is that wasn't a real restraint. It's kind of, it's a restraint, but it's not really being used as such. So what is that? Is that staging? Now, they seem to think that is staging. I don't. I see that as something else. I see that as part of the play or the spiel of whatever is going on with John Bonet, probably even with her consent, just prior to her death. So you could call that staging of the game, of the event, of the activity, but I don't think that is what the FBI are talking about. They're talking about crime scene staging. And so what was going on there, I don't think there was the intention to commit the crime that ended up being the crime. I think there was the intention to commit something that was supposed to be fun, perhaps. So going back to Perfect Murder, Perfect Town, page 498, quote, the ligature that suffocated John Bonet, though she would eventually have died from the head injury, was in their opinion, this is the FBI profilers, an unusual cover-up attempt, if that was what it was, end quote. Can you see how confusing it's getting? So now they're saying, that John Bonet would likely have died from the head injury if there was nothing else involved. I don't think that is how she died. She died of asphyxiation of the ligature around her neck. What they're suggesting here is that the ligature was potentially trying to cover up the head injury. I don't really understand that, because you don't know that there is a head injury. It's possible. You could say maybe the whoever found John Bonet found a lot of blood. There's blood coming out of her ear and nostrils, and it was obvious, maybe there was a bat lying right next to her, and it was obvious what had happened. We don't know. It's possible that Her body was literally washed down with water. Her hair is pretty, in the crime scene photos, her hair does look quite messy for a little pageant princess, so who knows. But contention that's being made here is that the ligature, the noose and the stick, also called the garrote, was part of staging, and I don't think that was part of the staging. So I don't think somebody came after the fact and said, okay, let's make this look more severe. I do think that the duct tape was part of the staging, and not there wasn't really much staging in terms of the body itself. There was, removing clothing, wiping down, but besides that, not really a lot. The ransom note, I guess, is a lot of elaborate staging. Then it refers to the cord had been made into a noose with the stick tied 17 inches from the knot, and that suggested staging rather than a bona fide attempt to strangle JonBenet. I've got to agree with that. I don't think the intention was to actually strangle JonBenet. I think the intention was to restrain JonBenet, just like the cords around her wrists were meant as almost more of a symbolic way of restraining her. So by, when it's Valentine's Day or whatever, and someone is on a bed and they have their wrists tied, perhaps with handkerchiefs or a scarf, to the back of the bed, those people can potentially get out of those restraints, but by submitting to them, they're basically saying, yes, I am willing to be seduced. Now, in a sense of a child, I think it's a totally inappropriate word to use, but it is a similar thing that is going on. It is consenting to something, right? The point has been made that the garrote was possibly made kind of in front of JonBenet. It was actually made there and then, and that does seem to suggest either consent or that whoever was with JonBenet wasn't afraid, or JonBenet wasn't afraid of this person while this was going on. So now it's time to get practical and apply what I've said about the woods for the trees and keeping one foot in the door. And as I say, as soon as you start looking through the straw, you better make sure what you're seeing is true, that it's real, that you know what you're seeing. Otherwise, it's not going to connect properly to everything else, and you're going to go off track. So we go now to a document from the District Attorney's Office, which I think already tells you something. And at the time then was November 7th, 2007. And it was under the sort of authority or custodianship of Mary Lacey. She was the district attorney then. There's quite a lot to say about her, but we are going to refer to the JonBenet Ramsey death investigation. So this was a report sent from the Bow Technology Group, but bear in mind the date, 2007 November, almost 10 years after the JonBenet Ramsey case started. So this is very late in the game, and what is this all about? Well, they are kind of reviewing some of the evidence. I'm not going to go through all of it, but what I am going to refer to is the bottom of page 4. It starts, history of items submitted for DNA analysis, and it goes, garrote, composed of white-colored cord, olefin, in brackets, this is further identified as polypropylene, braided, wrapped 6 times around a paintbrush handle, about 4.5 inches in length to form a knot. And so it is identifying this cord as kind of a plastic cord, polypropylene olefin, right? Now, in my books, I went into some detail investigating this, and when you really go into it, you can see that something like a polypropylene cord would be used in things like water skiing and washing lines and perhaps even outdoor furniture. And so you can kind of get where that's going. It is something that is sort of weatherproof, to some extent also waterproof, right? But it is kind of a fairly rigid plastic, and you can use it in a braided setup, such as a rope or a string, right? So 2 areas of stain on the cord were cut out, and the Colorado Bureau of Investigation analyzed the cuttings for DNA, and they found that the DNA from the 2 stains matched the victim's DNA. In other words, there were John Bonet's DNA, possibly from blood or saliva or touch DNA on these stains. And that was obviously, even though this is from a report from 2007, that was analysis conducted by the CBI many years prior. Now, what's quite interesting in this Bode report is that it makes the note of the fact that the cord did not match any similar cord located in the Ramsey home. It also mentions that John Ramsey may have touched the garrote and touched this nylon, and we know that he did, but they didn't really conduct any further DNA analysis on it due to the high probability of a DNA mixture being present. In other words, you're not going to get the DNA profile of a single person, you might get multiple people. So it's not really of any use. Then on the next page, which I believe is page 5, it refers to ligature from wrists, and this is quoting from the report, bear in mind dated 2007. Quote, composed of white colored cord, olefin in brackets polypropylene, braided, similar in size and construction with the cord used in forming the garrote. When her father found John Bonet Ramsey, a ligature was attached to each of her wrists. Both ends of the wrist ligature were frayed. John Ramsey removed the ligature encircling his daughter's left wrist. The ligature encircling John Bonet's right wrist was loosely tied. End quote. Let me rephrase that. So the ligature, the knot, the string, the cord around John Bonet's right wrist, which was still in place, was loosely tied. Now, if you compare that to the severity of the noose around her neck, which is extremely tightly snared around her neck, can you see they don't really match up? The one is very severe, and the other is very relaxed. Okay. Then going back to the report, quote, both knots remained intact. The knot encircling the victim's right wrist was tied loosely over long sleeve white pajamas, end quote. So that is reinforcing that the knot isn't secure, the cord around her wrist isn't even snug against her skin. It is basically just there for show. It is not really doing anything. And then it refers to 2 loops measuring about 15.5 inches. The knot attached to John Bonet's right wrist was a lark's head knot, also known as a cow hitch or a capsized reef knot, or more commonly a square knot. And so I'm not going to talk more about the knots right now, even though we're very close to the area of it, dealing with the nylon cord. But that is why I say we need to go through this step by step, looking through a straw, but we need to know what we're looking at. And so according to this report, which seems very authoritative, it seems very professional, we are dealing with olefin or polypropylene, and that apparently is the definition, that the type of material that we're dealing with. And as they say here, no other such material was found in the Ramsey house. And so what are we actually angling at? What is this actually getting at, this whole line of inquiry? Well, what it's trying to say is that this material, this cord, was brought inside the Ramsey home from the outside. This is what the intruder had with him. The intruder was armed with this as kind of a weapon, right? Now, we also know that he fashioned, or she fashioned, the garrote inside the house. So the weapon that was brought, in other words, these pieces of rope, were incomplete, and somehow the intruder, according to this narrative, seemed to know or anticipate that he would get the other parts of his equipment inside the home, right? That is one version of this story, based on this assumption that this material we're dealing with is olefin or polypropylene, which I don't believe it is. But if you do believe it is, well, then you are happily kind of going down the yellow brick road of the intruder narrative, kind of clicking your heels as you go down. But I'm going to go to an alternative definition of that nylon cord, and we're going to get that from Steve Thomas's book. And then we're going to get reinforcement from that via Detective Kolar. And many people will argue, and you can actually see some of these arguments on certain forums where people will say, oh, that was definitely olefin, and you know what, besides that, fibers of this olefin were found in John Bonet's bed. And so what does that tell you? Well, it tells you, and this is also Lou Smith's position, that so John Bonet was, I guess, strangled or garroted in her bed. And so that makes complete sense because these fibers were found in her bed as well. And so, you know, it makes complete sense. That is where John Bonet was, I guess, murdered. And that is then where these cords left these fibers. And in the next section, in the Patreon section, we're going to see why that makes absolutely no sense. So if you'd like to listen to it on Patreon, head on to patreon.com/TCRS. It's on the $2 tier. There's also a lot of other content there. Hundreds of posts on the Chris Watts case and Madeleine McCann, Amanda Knox, Letitia Stork, Suzanne Morphew, and of course Laurie Vallow. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you guys next time. So if you were an amateur investigator, you might be doing cartwheels saying, you know, I've solved the case. The cord doesn't come from inside the house. We know where the actual ground zero of the crime scene is because we found these fibers. It's olefin. But what you might be missing is that you also get olefin in carpet